Good afternoon. This is Kyle Welch with RCR Wireless News. Thank you for attending DDoS and DNS, New Threats and Mitigation Techniques, presented by Infoblox. Our presenters today are Peter Luff, Director, Service Provider Marketing at Infoblox, Dr. Srinivas Mantripragada, VP Technology at Infoblox, and helping out with the Q&A today will be Jim Zelnowski, Senior Systems Engineer at Infoblox. Just a reminder to all of our attendees that within 24 hours of this webinar, we will provide you with a link to the on-demand version of today's webinar. During the webinar, we encourage everyone to submit their questions via the control panel, which will be answered at the end of the presentation. With that being said, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Peter.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Peter Luff, Director of Marketing at Infoblox, the service provider business, and I'd like to briefly review the agenda first of all. We're going to talk a little bit about Infoblox and our service provider business for those of you that are not too familiar with us, and discuss some of the challenges that our service provider customers are dealing with today. We've got some interesting results from an industry survey that's just become available, so we'll share a few highlights from that, and then Srinivas is going to talk about the main body of the presentation today, which is the DNS and denial of service attacks and the threats that we're seeing, and some new mitigation techniques that we can apply. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about what Infoblox is doing about this specifically, and then we'll go in, after a quick review of those solutions, we'll go into a Q&A session. So we'll look forward to your questions later on in the afternoon. So with that said, let's take a quick look at Infoblox and our service provider business. Those of you that have known Infoblox for a while, we've been around since 1999, specialized in automation around DNS servers and DNS server procedures and so forth. And Infoblox has built a very healthy enterprise-facing business there. But of course, we're also selling to service providers, and we've been doing that for some while now. And when I came into the company about 4 years ago, we actually built together a dedicated service provider business unit with our own salespeople, marketing, systems engineering, development engineers, product management, all under a dedicated business unit. And that's enabled us to bring a renewed focus on the service provider business to the point where we're now actually building focused products specifically for service providers. And we've actually taken a really strong lead in that business, as you can see from this slide. We've reached a really strong position in DNS caching. We've introduced the first DNS firewall aimed at malware protection. Not really the subject of today's discussion, but we're also now in a position to bring in something new and unique, which is our DNS DDoS protection solution. You'll hear more about that as we go through today, as well as a carrier product line that really helps us to deal with some very, very high DNS loads, and DNS traffic is really on the increase. So we're able to handle 1 million queries per second, for example, from top-end servers. So all in all, we've sold about 200 service providers and about 6,900 enterprise customers, having a really good time. And Infoblox, as you may know, was able to go public almost 2 years ago on the New York Stock Exchange in a very successful IPO. So it's just a quick thumbnail sketch on Infoblox, having some fun here. So let's take a look at the challenges that our service provider customers face. And these may be mobile operators, wireline operators, or cloud providers. Doesn't really matter. Each one of them has a set of unique challenges, but in general, they fall into these three categories. Securing the network, which is really the principal topic for today. Enhancing the customer experience, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, improving operational efficiency. We're not going to cover so much of that today, but we can certainly talk to you about those things offline. So let's take a look, first of all, at security in its context. And it's very clear from an industry study that was just made available in January. This is from Arbor Networks. That the #1 exposure in mobile networks, for example, looking into 2014, the #1 exposure in mobile networks, DNS servers. So it's very clear the bad guys are going after your DNS servers. If you look a little bit further into the data that came out of that report, some additional information here showing that the top targets in terms of protocols, as you can see here, right up top, HTTP, which you would expect, and DNS, 77%. So those two neck and neck for the top targets. And DNS is rising quite substantially over last year, where it was at 70%. So DNS is clearly in the crosshairs of the bad guys, along with your DNS servers. Another way of looking at the same data, what are the top three concerns? DNS there, right up there in those top three, attacks on services. So some very interesting revelations that came from this survey just made available in January. And some of the findings were actually quite shocking. Clearly, a third of respondents experienced customer impacting DDoS attacks on their infrastructure, which is a big number in itself. But the thing that really blows my mind is the second statement here. 26% of respondents indicated that there's no security group within their organization with a formal responsibility for DNS security, even though DNS attacks are on the increase and DNS exposure is seen as rising, not falling. But still, over a quarter of respondents say they have no one actually responsible for this. So it's quite a shocking revelation. So an interesting way to set the scene here before we get started. So before we leave that topic completely, let's take a quick look at customer experience. And this is really key to DNS. And why is DNS important? So customer experience, of course, is one of the main reasons why you and I stay with our current cell phone provider, or we decide to make a switch. And one of the main reasons would be response time. So customer experience in a mobile network, for example, is absolutely crucial. If you look, for example, the numbers on the right-hand side of this slide represent the number of DNS transactions that happen in order for you to access a Facebook page or an iTunes account, 14 DNS lookups, 36 DNS lookups when you initialize an iPhone on the network. So an awful lot of DNS traffic is growing rapidly, mostly driven by smartphones and social media, as you can see. This traffic wasn't there 5, 6, 7 years ago. So the DNS traffic levels are really mushrooming and just hammering the infrastructure of service provider networks. So what is the key things to establish with DNS? First of all, low latency, so that when you hit a social media page, it downloads really fast. When you're going online and video gaming, you get a fast response. If you're accessing your favorite videos on YouTube, they're there right away. They don't take too long to load up. So low latency is really key, and DNS is right in the middle of that. If DNS is slow, you'll get a really slow response time. Likewise, it has to be really reliable. So service providers need ultra low latency, industrial strength DNS, and finally, of course, it has to be secure. And that's really the subject of today's session, is that security. How do we secure our DNS systems against the bad guys, especially those that are looking to flood us out with denial of service attacks and other DNS-based exploits going after our DNS servers. So with that said, to set the scene, I'd like to bring Dr. Srinivas Mantripragada, our VP of Technology, on the line and pass across to him. Srinivas, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, for the nice intro. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As Peter mentioned, DNS-based threats are growing by the numbers, and here in this presentation, I will drill down a little bit more into the details on from our research, security research team, what we have found, and explain that a little bit more detail. So networks are constantly being exploited using DNS, and what from our research has shown that essentially they fall into two broad categories, what we call as infrastructure-based attacks, which are mainly outside-in attacks. It is attacks that are primarily focused on disruptions of DNS services, and inside-out attacks, which are what we call as attacks that essentially use DNS as a vector for business exploitation. And these are very two different subtle categories of or should we say classes of attacks. And examples of like infrastructure attacks or outside-in attacks would be more your classic DOS, DDoS, or cache poisoning, manipulating responses, or protocol anomaly, fuzzing, things like that, with a primary intent on disrupting the core DNS infrastructure or DNS-based services. The second category is more around what we call as DNS exploits, and that's something like where malwares, the rising malwares, which are essentially using DNS to evade existing traditional defense mechanisms, whether it's domain fluxing, wire domain fluxing, or APTS, tunneling frauds, phishings, and things like that. So from our research, here is some of the most high-profile ones that we have sampled in the last year or so. And in the first category, which is on the high-profile DNS infrastructure attacks, we have seen increasing attacks that rely on DNS to disrupt the core infrastructure services. Examples would be the historic DDoS attacks that we all are familiar with early last year, where large DNS-based amplification attacks targeted some key banks from JP Morgan, Bank of America, PNCs, and so on. And there wasn't a well-rounded protection for that. And the same thing applies for GoDaddy DNS servers, which actually also went down with a similar style of attack, which was essentially a combination of amplification and reflection-based attacks. On the extreme right, you also saw, examples of cache poisoning, DNS cache poisoning, where, where either the Google and the Yahoo's records in their Romanian domains, they were hijacked, or essentially the cache poisoned, and the DNS traffic was essentially rerouted to a rogue server that the hackers controlled. A similar example where the Syrian Electronic Army also apparently hacked into the records of the Twitter site, and they modified the DNS records to reflect it to the servers that were hosted by the SEA. So all this shows that, and then on the bottom right is the spam host. We all know spam host, for its well-reputed filtering service to weed out spam emails, and this became a victim of a large-scale, volumetric style of DDoS attacks. So as you see here, so we are seeing a combinations of, traditional DDoS, we are seeing, reflection, amplification, cache poisoning, and of course, volumetric styles of DDoS attacks. The second example would be more around the latter category, which we call as the inside-out category. And here, on the inside-out is where the malwares, they communicate with the command and control machines, and they use the DNS to essentially evade your traditional firewalls, because traditional firewalls leave port 53 open. So a few examples of that would be something like your Kelly Haas botnets, your TDS, malwares, which use a combination of fluxing either at the IP layer or at the domain layer to evade existing defense mechanisms and communicate with their command and control servers to do one of many things, whether it is mass distribution of spam emails or insider data leakages, to name a few. So the key question to ask would be is that DNS as a protocol has been around for a long time now. So the key question to ask is why suddenly there's an upsurge in DNS security attacks, and why as a mobile operator should you be concerned about protecting DNS security? So these are the five main reasons that we felt from our observations of the kinds of threat attack vectors. One is evasion, definitely DNS. Traditional firewalls leave port 53 open, and so essentially DNS is not as fortified as much as perhaps your web or email or some of the other protocols are. So that essentially becomes a new vector for attackers to evade existing defense mechanisms. Second thing is that DNS is a part of your core critical infrastructure. So if a DNS failure means that a mobile network essentially fails, so mobile services stop working. So that is a key, very interesting asset as part of the attackers are concerned. It also has nice asymmetry properties. So with a relatively low investment from the hackers' perspective, whether it is renting bot infrastructure and being able to create a very large scale denial of service attacks, it has some very nice asymmetric amplification properties that makes it very attractive from a hacker perspective. The fourth is that essentially it's anonymous. So the stateless DNS protocol, it also allows the attackers to conceal their identity. It's very hard to go back and figure out the sources where it came from, because you can always spoof the sources, and it becomes relatively hard to identify the source of the attacks. And last but not the least, it's pervasive. So essentially, DNS activity, as Peter mentioned, is virtually everywhere. As with 4G and LTE networks, virtually every application that you touch has a DNS component to it. It makes it an easy target for the hackers to essentially take advantage of. So here are a few examples again in more detail on the first category, which is the outside in. An example of that DOS, DDoS would be where the command and control will instruct your bots. The command and control would send commands to the infected servers, and this could be anywhere in the world. And these bots would then request like recursion and ask for a known site, essentially triggering amplification as part of the DNS query. And by the way, they also spoof their sources so that the responses, instead of going back to them, they actually would be redirected to a non-existing IP address. So in that process, DNS server gets choked on request to responses, and that's what we have seen as one attack pattern in the first category. The second category is where the attacks are using the DNS server's amplification attack. So here, the attackers, they actually spoof the DNS queries, and they send multiple of these DNS queries to several of these servers, and the servers would then send out amplified responses from the incoming queries. And by the way, these queries are also then redirected to an innocent victim, whether it's your financial bank or some other e-commerce portal, and then essentially bringing it down. And that's what we saw as a major, or at least one of the major categories of the attack patterns from the inside out DDoS attacks last year and beginning of this year as well. These other example of the inside out where malwares, essentially you bring an infected device, a mobile device, and then this mobile device then is brought into the network. It spreads itself inside the network. It makes a DNS query, and then it phones the home, and it makes a connection to the CNC and Botnet servers. So as a result, the infected device then essentially becomes a part of a larger bot network. And by the way, this malware also fluxes the domains. It uses dynamic algorithms, and essentially there isn't any one static, like a rule or a filter or a defense mechanism that you could apply and be ensured with, because they are constantly changing their patterns on the fly. So in summary, these are the broad categories of threats from a DNS perspective that we have sampled, looking at large volumes of data coming from several service providers in the orders of several billion records per day. And we saw that essentially these attack patterns, either, as I said, are outside in, comprising of cache poisoning attacks, which are essentially illegitimate corruption of DNS records, or DOS, DDoS attacks, which are essentially more on the flooding, the amplification, the reflection, denial of service, on exploiting the vulnerabilities in the applications, to redirection, which is essentially manipulating the responses or man-in-the-middle kinds of attacks, to geo-based threats, which are high percentage of threats which are originating from specific locations, to protocol attacks, which are essentially malformed packets, vulnerabilities, buffer overflows, or insertions. So these is a pretty broad patterns of threats that we have seen that exploit DNS in some form. The second one is more around the using DNS as an inside out, which is essentially where tunneling frauds, data leakages, fluxing. There's a lot of fluxing of IPs that is happening at extremely high frequencies. DGAs, domain phishing, domains or APT threats, and so on. So in summary, it's a pretty broad spectrum, both from what I call as the breadth of the attacks as well as the depth of the attacks. And to take you further, Peter will talk more about the specific solutions we have on Infoblox side.
All right, so thank you very much, Srinivas, for that. I'd just like to take a few minutes here and talk a little bit about so what can we do about all this, and what is Infoblox doing. So if you look at Infoblox Advanced DNS Protection, what is this? This is actually something brand new and unique. And this is the first DNS server that can protect itself from denial of service attacks or other DNS exploits. And what we're doing is really building a hardware-based pattern detection capability into a DNS server. And this is an additional set of hardware that doesn't touch the DNS server's computation. So the DNS server is doing what it does. It's serving DNS responses, DNS queries. But there's a separate dedicated piece of hardware that's actually doing pattern recognition and detection and then taking action to drop or pass this traffic to the DNS server. So we're able to protect the DNS server with this specialized hardware-based screen. Inside that hardware processing unit, we're also able to distinguish between legitimate traffic and attack traffic. So we're able to make a determination before that traffic ever reaches the server. So this is very different from an approach like response rate limitation, where the responses actually reach the server, queries reach the server first, and then we decide how to respond or at what rate to respond. By this time, you've already hit the server with extra load. So we're actually able to discriminate against that and drop those packets and stop that traffic ever reaching a DNS server. So it's able to relax the DNS server somewhat. We add to that some centralized visibility for all of the DNS servers that we're running and managing so that we can see what attacks are going on across the network through a detailed series of reports. From one central location, I can see potentially dozens or hundreds of DNS servers, and we have customers doing just that. And it does run into the hundreds in terms of the number of DNS servers they can view from a centralized location. And what we're able to do then is to see individual server performance or an aggregate of network-wide performance. The nice thing here is this is a single place to go, a single repository of all this information. And the alternative would be to go in and log into every single server individually and go look at the logs and write it all down on a piece of paper, perhaps. So we've got this centralized visibility that adds a lot of value and insight as to what to do with the attack scenario. And the third element is an ongoing protection against new threats as they emerge. So these are automated updates that are coming through, in this case on a daily basis, based on the changing threat landscape. And the nice thing here is that rather than waiting for an open source patch, for example, to bind software for a couple of days for that to show up, I can actually make changes as the new threats emerge. And I can do that without scheduling maintenance windows. This is a GUI configuration as opposed to a reboot and a new software load and a patch and a change to the operating system and so forth. So this is a very, very seamless impact on the organization where I don't have to do all of this with maintenance windows. So it's very seamless and gives you a chance to respond very, very rapidly to newly emerging threats. So how it works, this is not really, I guess, how it works so much as where it's located. We have a grid of Infoblox servers. For those of you that are familiar with Infoblox, the Infoblox grid is a network that brings these servers together and that helps them to function as one. And our threat traffic is out there hitting the servers, so we've got legitimate traffic mixed in with all kinds of attacks, and that's hitting our DNS servers. But the incoming updates are distributed across by our grid master to all of the other DNS servers in our grid, and then we're able to see exactly what is going on. So we can see through the grid, we can see what's going on in terms of the attack spectrum. To give you a quick look at that, we can organize our reports by individual server, by severity, by times, and so forth, and see these things, different categories of attack, where let's look at all the flood attacks, let's look at all the cache poisoning attacks, and so forth, and group them together and see them in different ways and see their impact over time, whether they're severe, critical, information only, what are we going to do with them? So we've got a good level of analysis to see all of this information. So what attacks do we protect against? Really the two types at the highest level, and I've broken the screen into the top half and bottom half. The top half are really the volumetric flooding type attacks that are going to cause deluge of traffic, reflection and amplification in particular. And the bottom half are the DNS exploits. So we can protect against whole slew of attacks within these categories. So many tens or hundreds of attack types within these categories. So a very comprehensive set of threats that we can protect against. And this is not just denial of service attacks. This is also the nasty attacks like cache poisoning and the particular DNS tunneling, which is a big issue for service providers generally, because not only is it a security threat, it's also, of course, a revenue leakage opportunity that's happening. So concern there also on the revenue side. And all of this is happening, don't forget, inside the DNS server. So these things, cache poisoning is extremely difficult to do any other way. If you're not inside the DNS server, you're not going to be able to see these things and take action against them. So let's take a look and see how these things are deployed. We can protect, of course, authoritative DNS servers or caching servers, and handle some very high-speed caching requirements as well. So if you take a look, first of all, authoritative web-facing attacks. So we've got our authoritative servers out in the demilitarized zone, in the DMZ, sitting there taking traffic, good and bad, from the web environment. And we're protecting that web presence or e-commerce presence at the front doorstep, on the front of the house. This may also be inside the mobile network. We'll have authoritative servers also for things like gateway location, or the email, or the app store, things like that as well. Would also have authoritative DNS servers. Roaming gateway location, things like that would also be authoritative servers. And so we can protect all of those. Alternatively, we can be protecting something like the DNS caching layer. This is where there's a lot of exposure. And so we can protect these. These are a little bit further inside the network, but it's still possible to flood up these servers as well. And then finally, on the inside of the network, this could be inside a service delivery network, looking at the OSS systems and so forth. There could well be internal DNS running in order to just provide DNS on the application server locations and topology and so forth. So there could be an internal DNS, or this could be protecting the general office network for general office requirements too. So all of that can be protected. And how are these delivered? Well, these are advanced appliances. There are three physical platforms, and overall 4 variants of this. The 1400, small, medium, large, 1400, 2200, 4000 series units. And these come with various combinations of AC and DC power, multiple hard drives, multiple fans, hot swappable power supplies, and so forth. So fully hardened appliances, no root access. You can't get in and turn it into something else. This enables these environments to be totally locked down as a fully protected, hardened DNS server. How do these stack up against alternative approaches? If you look at the other ways that people tend to try and protect DNS, typically they are probably either using a load balancer with a server, or they're using a general purpose DDoS device. And some people are also using IPSs or firewalls in front of DNS servers, which are fairly ineffective, but it does tend to get used that way. Load balancers, as you can see, are very good at protecting against the flooding, high volume attacks. We heard one customer say that what a load balancer does is it distributes the pain, but I've still got the pain. So the load balancer will definitely help distribute some of that, but it does not really give protection against the types of attacks that we're looking at here. Certainly a general purpose DDoS device are blind to DNS. They're really not looking at DNS traffic as being any different from anything else. And so they can certainly handle the flood attacks, but not the DNS exploits, as you can see. Next-gen firewalls, fantastic devices, do an awful lot of things very, very well, but they're not particularly DNS aware. They're not really very effective because of the way that they process and handle state. Firewalls and IPS devices generally get locked up under a DNS condition, under a DDoS condition pretty rapidly. So they're less suited for that. And cloud, it may be that there are some cloud-based solutions that can shovel traffic upstream, but that's generally not used in a service provider environment. So bottom line, DNS is really a core asset, and it's very often left wide open. The bad guys clearly are going after your DNS servers. They really are. but we think we're in a position to help. So with this new advanced DNS protection, we can provide an embedded capability inside of a server that will stop DDoS attacks, stop the other exploits, give you a lot of visibility and reporting, and it scales all the way up for the largest of large carriers, and we're in the largest of large carriers, and all the way down to the small regional ISPs or small telcos. So we think that we have something for everybody with this range of solutions. Well, thank you for giving us your time today. We really appreciate it. And I'd like to turn it now back to Kyle, and we'll take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We've had a few questions come in during the presentation. So if anyone wants to answer, feel free. The first one we had is, what are the features of advanced DNS protection?
Yeah, this is Jim Zolnowski. I'm the Senior System Engineer at Infoblox. Let me just kind of summarize, because there was a lot of information that was thrown out here. At a high level, there's probably 5 key elements of the advanced DNS protection system. One is DNS threat protection. It continuously monitors, detects, and drops packets. DNS-based type attacks, including DDoS. 2, there's automatic updates, so automatic updates to mitigate evolving threats using threat analysis and research. 3, it's centralized visible, so you get detailed and centralized view of the attack types and patterns. 4, it's very tunable, so there's the ability to do tunable traffic thresholds for rules based on customers' unique traffic flow patterns. So you can block specific types of DNS traffic that are relevant to what you need to see in your not evolving in your network. And 5 is the enhanced processing. This next generation programmable processor, accelerator card that provides the dedicated compute for threat mitigation.
Thanks. We have another question for you, Jim, that came in. So DNS servers in this presentation, does it refer to caching, authoritative, or all of the above?
Actually, all of the above, depending on the configuration this product is appropriate in all those areas.
Okay, great. Peter, we had a question that came in for you. Do you know current breakdown and trends for DNS requests between IPv4 and IPv6?
The one-word answer would be no. We don't have the definitive number. Obviously, it varies from service provider to service provider. What I can say is that we see those service providers that are deploying V6 handsets obviously are seeing very large proportions of IPv6 traffic. Where there is a mix, like some of the big tier 1 providers, we're seeing DNS V6 traffic can be as high as 25–30% of the total DNS traffic on the network. That's DNS traffic, not total traffic, but 25–30% of DNS traffic could be V6, if that answers your question. We're certainly seeing that ramp up substantially over the last year or so.
Thank you.
If there's more on that, we can certainly do an offline follow-up with the person that asked that question.
Great. And Srinivas, we have a question that came in for you. How well do security analytics tools identify these types of DNS security issue signatures, and are they effective?
That's a pretty broad question, but definitely security analytics does play a very important role, and it really depends on where it sits in the network. I mean, there are lots of analytic tools, both offline and online, and mining and correlating and aggregating, and perhaps not just DNS, but DNS along with other kinds of traffic, structured or unstructured data, whether it's log traffic and so on. Yes, they all have an important role to play. More the data that you can mine, definitely it allows better visibility and detection. But again, there's a trade-off between inline, real-time detection and response versus offline and more as a post-mortem kind of a thing. So it really depends on what the key requirements are.
Okay, thanks. Peter, we have another question that came in for you, and after that, if anyone else wants to answer this as well. Peter, what is Infoblox's view of DNS SEC?
DNS Sec. yes. DNSSEC is security extension for DNS. For those of you that are not familiar with DNSSEC, it's really a way of extending DNS with zone signature, like adding a layer of certification to a DNS query for added security. And it was initially intended to guard against the cache poisoning concern. So we see it out there. We support it as a standard feature in all of our DNS servers. We also provide a lot of automation of the DNS zone signing and certification and recertification process that is very, very onerous if you're going to take that on yourself. There's something like 30 steps that you would normally go through once a month with every zone to keep your zones current. We automate all of that in our DNSSEC solution. Having said that, we don't see a whole lot of DNSSEC out there. We see it in small pockets, little pieces of the federal government from time to time, although it was mandated. It hasn't really, you wouldn't think it was mandated by the level of deployment. So we don't see a whole lot of it, and we see very little of it outside North America. If there are folks out there with a different view, we'd certainly love to have that debate and learn a little bit more from you as well. But so far, we're not seeing a whole lot of interest. It does come up on RFPs and RFIs as something that we need to support, but it's not something that seems to be driving forward with any strong momentum at this stage. But maybe it will as the overall level of security threat seems to increase, that people will start to address DNSSEC even further. Hope that answers your question.
All right, thanks. We had another question come in.
Comment on that?
Good. Moving on, we had another question come in on advanced DNS protection. So what are the unique components of the advanced DNS protection solution that makes it different than the standard Infoblox appliance?
Yes, Jim, I'll take that. So our standard DNS and our standard appliance is a software product in the appliance that does DNS and DHCP and IP address management. The advanced DNS protection solution is really a special purpose appliance that has the dedicated processor for that advanced DNS protection service. And the second part of it is the advanced DNS protection service itself. This is a term-based service that includes protection features, hardware and software maintenance and support. And this service also includes automatic updates to new firmware or threat rules as new attacks emerge.
Great. Another question that came in is, what method is used to update the rules from the Infoblox server, and how often does the automatic rule updates happen on the advanced appliances? Sorry.
Yeah, so as part of the advanced DNS protection service, there is a method to update the rules to the Infoblox server. That method is HTTPS, and the automated rules happen every 24 hours. Customers have the option to pull the latest rules on demand. And but Infoblox IT provides the automatic update rules every 24 hours.
Okay, and we had a question coming in for Srinivas. Can you explain what is meant by fast-fluxing?
Yeah, fast-fluxing is a common term that's used where the malware actually can flux either at the IP layers, so that essentially it is fluxing patterns of IPs, and so that can evade existing filters. And in the process, one of them could be a hit. One of maybe 10,000 or hundreds of thousands could hit to a server that it would be listening to and talking to. So that's fluxing at the IP layer. But then there's also fluxing at the domain layer, where multiples of domains could be fluxing in an attempt to essentially hash to an IP server that's listening. So these fluxes can happen at various layers, and the primary intent is essentially to evade existing defenses, because then it will be hard to put like a static ACL or an IP filtering rule to block it.
Okay. Next question is, can I use signature subscriptions from another vendor with Infoblox products?
The answer is actually no. The advanced DNS protection threat rules are specifically crafted for DNS and for the specific hardware from Infoblox and can't be used with third-party signatures at this time.
Okay. And what version of NIOS is needed?
Okay, so our network operating system version that currently supports the advanced DNS protection is our latest that came out in the first of the year. That's version 6.10.
Okay, 6.10. Next question coming in is, can the advanced appliance be configured as an external or an internal DNS server?
Yeah, this is kind of talked about during this session. So the advanced appliance, which is the PT1400, the PT2200, and the PT4000, and the difference between those is really the queries per second, the amount of records, because you can configure those as external authoritative DNS servers for external DNS, or as internal recursive cache servers, or a combination within the same environment.
Great. Another one, can DNS firewall run on the advanced appliances?
Yeah, so it was talked about in the seminar that that we can mitigate the botnets using advanced threat, the APTS, which is advanced threat capabilities out there. DNS firewall is the inside-out blocking of queries off the list. It's part of bind RPZ, and it can be configured on internal DNS recursive servers. And all the customer would really need to do is purchase a license for the DNS firewalls separately for the advanced protection appliances that you're already using.
All right, thanks. I have another question. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, this is Peter with a comment. Sorry, there was an earlier point about those incoming feeds. The threat protection feed that applies to the advanced protection appliances is a different feed from the feed that goes into DNS firewall. And so I think the person that was asking the question might have been referring to other industry feeds that are available. And so those feeds generally are malware-related feeds, a list of malicious domains and blacklisted sites. Those feeds from other sources we can take into the DNS firewall solution, separate from APT. So it's two separate feeds that we're talking about. I just wanted to clarify that. So we can use an Infoblox feed for malware, or we can use other industry feeds that the customer may already have access to. And it's just a configuration.
Yeah, that's important to point out. I'm glad you brought that up, Peter, because the DNS firewall is really running response policies on RPZ under bind. And with that, you're actually doing a zone transfer from an external primary. That primary, in our case, we provide a service feed that we analyze 35 various different threat vector sources to eliminate false positive, and then we do the zone transfer on a 2-hour basis to update the recursive cache server with the updated response policy zone feed. Now, that doesn't preclude other feeds from things like Spamhaus or other RPZ feeds that can be placed in the actual recursive server as part within the response policy zone. And it's kind of like a firewall. You know, you prioritize the list, the feeds that are in there to the first hit that you actually make against the listing would then stop the process. So obviously, you know, you can create local feeds for whitelist. So let's say I don't want to block access to foreign aspects of Eastern Europe or China or or the Middle East or something like that, because I do business there. But other areas I want to block. So you create a whitelist and put it at the top of the feed, and then you have your other feeds below that, so that you would hit and block or do a redirect of the query response in that recursive cache server. That's a long answer, but wanted to definitely indicate that there's a lot of flexibility with the DNS firewall.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. So that's about all the time we have. I just want to thank everyone for attending DDoS and DNS, New Threats and Mitigation Techniques, presented by Infoblox. Again, our presenters today were Peter Luff, Director, Service Provider Marketing at Infoblox, Dr. Srinivas Mantripragada, VP Technology at Infoblox, and then Jim Zilnowski, Senior Systems Engineer at Infoblox. Thank you, everyone, and just a reminder that we will have a recorded version of this webinar over to you within 24 hours.